Good afternoon. A warm welcome to everyone who has joined us today. My name is Michelle Wahome. I am a research fellow at the University of Strathclyde's One Ocean Hub, and I will be facilitating this discussion. I will begin with a brief introduction of our topic, then invite our panelists to provide some opening remarks, after which we'll have a discussion that includes questions from the audience. The UKRI Global Challenges Research Fund Hubs, or GCRF Hubs, are global interdisciplinary research projects that engage academic and non-academic colleagues from around the world. The projects are designed to address complex challenges. Often these are also reflected in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Our topic this afternoon is the practice of undertaking inclusive, collaborative, challenge-led research across global geographies. As the University of Strathclyde launches the Centre for Sustainable Development, we are hoping that reflecting on our experiences as members of GCRF hubs can provide lessons and food for thought for similar institutions. This roundtable includes researchers and partners from the GCRF One Ocean Hub and the GCRF Water Security and Sustainable Development Hub. The discussants will take on me, one another, and the audience and elaborate on their expertise and experience. Audience members, please use the Q&A function to ask questions as they occur to you. Our panelists today represent different categories of the networks of actors that are involved in collaborative research for development projects. Lisa MacDonald is a postdoctoral research associate with the One Ocean Hub. She is based at the School of Simulation and Visualization at the Glasgow School of Art. Lisa is also responsible for the project's Deep Emotional Engagement Program, the DEEP Fund, and management of art projects by makers based in Africa and the South Pacific. Lata Narayanaswamy is a lecturer in international development at the University of Leeds and is a researcher with the Water Security and Sustainability Hub. Her research critically reflects on gendered, intersectional, and post-colonial decolonial dynamics of development knowledge and its perceived contribution to global development challenges. Daniel Norte is an environmental and human ecologist with expertise in landscapes management and livelihood enterprise development. He is a program officer in charge of landscapes and livelihood initiatives for Hampuano, a local fisheries and coastal governance NGO in Ghana. He's also a PhD candidate at the University of Cape Coast. Jo Pitt is the program manager at the One Ocean Hub. She has a PhD in geology, and prior to the hub, she worked at the University of Strathclyde's Research and Knowledge Exchange Services Department. I work as the Responsible Research and Innovation Fellow at the One Ocean Hub. I am undertaking ethnographic action research, and I am interested in how research for development is done, and in particular, how processes that meet expectations around fairness and impact are developed and mobilized. Unfortunately, Taryn Pereira-Kaplan could not join us today. We are aiming to have an open and informative discussion that benefits from everyone's experiences and vantage points. I'd now like to invite the panelists to introduce themselves more fully, tell our audience about yourself, your work, and your role, and the ways in which you act as a bridge. Who are you connecting in the context of the hubs and why? So shall we begin in reverse alphabetical order? So we shall begin with Jo.
Great, thanks Michelle, and thanks so much for inviting me to join this discussion today. It's a really exciting area and definitely one that is of particular interest to me. So yeah, my name is Joanne Pitt, or Jo for short. I am the Programme Manager for the UKRI GCRF One Ocean Hub based here at Strathclyde. My role in the One Ocean Hub is really ultimately to support the research teams in each of the hub's focus countries to deliver research for sustainable development within the mandate that we laid out in our proposal. So within my portfolio of work, I lead in the operational aspects of the hub, in particular the financial and contractual processes of the programme, project reporting, as well as monitoring, evaluation and learning. In addition to these sort of bigger operational aspects, I'm also responsible for taking a kind of broader look at the wider project structure and partnerships to ensure that what we have in place can support our research intentions within our development mandate. So I guess that's really where my bridging role, as you put it, comes in many ways. The Hub is a really large network of 122 researchers across 10 different countries, 5 of which are our focus areas for impact. And so my first bridging role, I guess, was in establishing the foundations of the Hub and as an ongoing piece of work. And that's bridging between the many different university systems that are in place across those different countries with Strathclyde, as well as with our funder, UKRI, and trying to align those to enable the research to happen. And those systems are often very different and they often don't speak to each other in the same way. So this is an ongoing task, but it was certainly my first bridging role in the Hub. On the more research side, my job is really to support the research and the researchers in country. And in that, communication is really the key. And as I've said, with such a large number of researchers, the main challenge is keeping those teams and individuals connected. And so I often bridge between the teams as somebody who has a sort of bird's eye view of the Hub. Working across all of the different areas, it's often easier for me to connect researchers across research programmes, as well as different geographies to support interdisciplinarity as well as cross-regional learning. In my MEL work, my focus is really on that bridge between research and development. And as a research for development programme, we are effectively bringing those two different worlds together and bridging between research and development in many ways. And so connecting these is often challenging, and it is challenging the traditional research practices. So this is a bridging role that I'm particularly interested in how it can be done rather than just ensuring that it is done. How do we effectively bridge that role? And so within that, a major part is not just in terms of bridging the two kind of norms together, but also with our stakeholders and supporting our researchers to bridge out of the research network to the stakeholders that we are really looking to benefit, and is the reason the Hub is here. I think that's all from me.
Lata.
Right, thank you, Michelle. Firstly, thank you for the invitation to participate. It's wonderful to be here. So my name is Lata Narayanswamy. I am a lecturer in international development at the University of Leeds, who is a partner in the Water Security and Sustainable Development GCRF Hub. So I bring tidings from another global partnership hub, but obviously working in complementary areas. And I suppose, so for me, I suppose I was brought in as part of the initial process to think about the anthropological, social science elements of water security. I'm sure we'll talk about this some more, but where that's ended up now, first, let me start telling you a little bit about the hub. So the Water Security and Sustainable Development Hub, it sits across the UK, Malaysia, Ethiopia, Colombia, and India. And in what we've constituted as collaboratories. So the idea is that you're trying to create a critical mass of stakeholders within each country that cuts across academia, think tanks, government, other stakeholders, decision makers, NGOs, that then are meant to sort of be more than the sum of the parts, with a view to feeding into SDG 6. So we have 46 partners that cut across the 5 countries, and the UK is obviously the funder. We can talk about those dynamics shortly. And within the UK, the lead institution is Newcastle University. And so Leeds is another academic institutional partner, as is Oxford. So the idea here is very much to try to have dialogues that are cutting across the sort of the sciences and the social sciences. So trying to bring in to dialogue, that it matters, questions around, pollution and water pressure and where do I put the pipes or dig the wells has to come into dialogue with, who has the power to make those decisions? Where does the money come from? How do we meet the rights to water of people? How do we even uphold them and enforce them? And that all of those decisions in a way coexist. And if we're really going to get to the heart of what water security is and why it matters, we have to have that dialogue happening between these different stakeholders and these different worldviews. So in answer to your question, Michelle, about bridging, in the hub, I'm actually involved in the leadership of the ethics committee. And part of our mandate isn't just to think narrowly about the sort of the tick box exercises that tend to represent ethics at universities. Not that they're not valuable, they are hugely important, but they do tend to have a very narrow do no harm sort of approach. So that is, the project's already defined. I'm sending people out into a proverbial field, and then I have to tick these boxes about, am I going to be talking to people under the age of 18? Are we talking about things that are topics that are particularly sensitive? And I have to tick these boxes. Actually, what we're very interested in is also having a much bigger dialogue about what ethics means. What are the ethics and the values that we bring to the concept of water security? How is the question of water security an ethical issue? So the philosophy of ethics is something that I'm very much having an active dialogue at the moment, which is hugely rewarding, because actually bringing the scientists and the engineers into that space. The good thing about this hub is that actually, the scientists and the social scientists, there's huge amounts of energy for that dialogue to occur in a productive way. And I think it's the reason that we're able to have the conversations that we're having. But obviously it's hugely challenging, because when you've got these 46 partners spread across 5 countries, in a way, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in the next hour and a half, actually it's just the mechanics of making that happen, with all the will in the world, and we have huge amounts of goodwill in this hub to do these things. It's the actual mechanics of making that happen, which no doubt, Joe, you could probably speak volumes about in your role in trying to be that bridge very often, where people are probably coming to you with competing sorts of demands and needs. And so I look forward to having those discussions. And just one more thing, I'm really happy to be here, because I'm a real big fan of not reinventing the wheel. And I want us to be collectively having dialogues across these GCRF hubs, because if what we can do is try to capture some of these lessons so that we don't just talk today, but that we continue this dialogue off screen, as it were, in order for us to be able to compile these lessons, what's worked? Well, how do we learn from each other? So quite apart from the fact that, you're Ocean Hub, so you're interested in water, so we've got shared interests there. Actually, the business of making this work, what are the lessons derived there? How do we feed that back to the funders? If they're going to keep spending this kind of money, even on those very narrow instrumental things, how do we do this better in future? How are we doing it now? What's working? How can we do it better in future? So thank you so much for having me, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion this afternoon.
Thank you, Lata, for being here. Speaking of the mechanics of bringing everyone together, Taryn and Daniel, who are going to be sort of our global South representatives, are both not here, which is sort of indicative of that difficulty of bringing everyone together, getting on the same page on issues. But I'll move on to Lisa, and then we can have the discussion about all those issues.
Thanks, Michelle. I just want to echo Joe and Lada's sentiments by saying thank you for having me. And I'm really, really pleased to be a part of the discussion today. And I share Lada's enthusiasm for the ideas of sharing and collaboration. So I feel like I've got big shoes to follow after her very spirited introduction. My name is Lisa McDonald, and I, as Michelle mentioned, am a postdoc research associate with the One Ocean Hub. I'm based at the Glasgow School of Art, And my focus within the hub is to look at the relationships between the ocean and environment and emotional engagement. So what we're really interested in is looking at how art, and when we think about art, we mean that in its most broadest terms, how art and culture can be used not only as a way to express emotion and to share connection with different audiences and with each other, but also how the arts might be able to play a role in shifting policy or informing policy and informing decision. And so since 2009, I've worked in the South Pacific, so primarily in the west of the South Pacific, so Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu. And I'm really excited to have joined the hub and now have the opportunity to collaborate with colleagues in the Solomon Islands and Fiji. So what we're also doing through what we call the Deep Fund, as Michelle mentioned, is supporting art projects in our partner countries, both in the South Pacific and in Africa. So supporting art projects and looking at how we can give voice to artists and community groups and civil society organisations who perhaps have been excluded from a lot of these discussions in terms of policy and in terms of governance, and who sometimes are not included either in research projects that happen. So in terms of making those connections and building those bridges, absolutely for us, or a part of what the hub is doing, and for us is trying to really reach into our partner countries and find these incredibly talented artists and musicians and performers and also knowledge holders and cultural practitioners. So it's a really broad idea when we think about art and culture, and to provide them with the funding and also the space and time to be able to give us what sometimes can be thought of as an alternative view of issues around ocean governance, but absolutely, and I think we'll talk about this more as we do the session, but actually things that are really central to this idea of governance and the environment and nature. So thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Lisa. So to begin, I thought we might start by thinking about, as you said, Lata, the philosophy that sort of underpin the idea of the GCRF hubs, and one of them is transdisciplinarity, and the premise that integrating different kinds of expertise leads to better opportunities to resolve complex problems. Based on our experience of being in the hubs, do we think that this kind of engagement within the academic context does indeed produce solutions that cannot be generated by a single discipline or a single practitioner? And are we starting to see examples within our hubs? Lata, as the guest, why don't you begin?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure others will have lots to say about this. I mean, I think we might be in similar stages. So this funding has been active now for about a year and a half, give or take. And obviously we've had a pandemic, which is obviously unexpected and a real challenge at so many levels. And it has delayed some of the things that we may have wanted to do, some of the activities that we had planned, which we can also talk about just in terms of the actual administration of a grant. Absolutely. I think one of the real privileges of working in the hub has been to be a part of those trans or interdisciplinary discussions. Sort of one of the recent insights that I was at a webinar where sort of somebody made the point that we've got social and political challenges that we are facing, the various crises that we have. And they're not going to be solved with technical solutions. That is just not an option. So we can't just think about, what science we need. Science in any way is not objective or neutral. What gets funded, what gets researched, the perspective, the views, the stakeholders is all subjective and partial. But even if there are technical solutions to things, we need to be engaging with people, which is inevitably subjective and partial. We need to be thinking about power relations. You know, Lisa, you were talking about sort of the questions around governance and inclusion, and these aren't neutral areas. So that engagement is key. And I'm absolutely confident that when we actually try to bridge those gaps which exist, because one of the challenges is actually that in academia, we are incentivized to silo ourselves, right? So that's the first hurdle in a way that we have to overcome. We're not incentivized to work across disciplines, whether that's because you're expected to publish in your discipline's journals for the impact factor, or, you know, indeed in the social sciences, actually, we're not incentivized to work with other people at all. But public health is much better at this. Whereas, you know, the things that are good for my career are if I have single authored articles and monographs. So working with other people, very often you've got very basic challenges, like where are we going to publish this stuff? Because actually there's no journal that really, you know, meets those interdisciplinary criteria. They don't want to do it. So we've all these sorts of these mechanistic kinds of challenges, but we really have to try hard. And one of the benefits of these hubs is at least giving us some of that space and resource to work out how this works. But that's actually why I'm hugely enthusiastic about these dialogues, because I think anything that you are all doing in trying to bridge those gaps is something that we can learn from. And equally, the sorts of challenges, to sort of go back to your question, Michelle, about, you know, what are the challenges and where are we seeing some victories? Certainly that question of, say, you know, how do, say, questions of power have an effect on the science are dialogues that we are having actively in our hub at the minute. But that's also a huge learning opportunity for me. You know, it forces me out of my comfort zone. You know, how do I actually confront the things that I don't know about the science? So if we can make it a learning opportunity for everyone, I do think that outcome is very likely to be much more useful, if I can use that term, but potentially also longer lasting, because you've taken the time to not only work out sort of what the technical problem is, but who has to have buy-in for that technical problem to actually be solved. But also, does that technical problem solve everything? Well, actually, no, because, you know, say questions around access in the case of water security are deeply politicized problems. So that dialogue is the only way that we're going to solve those problems, but also potentially identify other problems that we're not even talking about. So yeah, I mean, it's hugely rewarding at a kind of personal, professional level, but I just don't think we're not going to be able to meet these global challenges without it, frankly. Thanks.
Thanks, Lata. I will want to come back to you about how you are having those dialogues, you know, the exact details about that. But you spoke about how we develop solutions around this. And so I wanted to bring in Joe to speak specifically about switching to a more country-led approach and, you know, how that has impacted interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity within the hub.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. It's such an interesting question, and thanks, Lata. The thought that kind of came to my head as you were talking is exactly what you've just said, Michelle, and that is, where's the challenge coming from, and what's the most appropriate response? I mean, transdisciplinarity is an ongoing discussion in our hub about to what extent are we being transdisciplinarity? How can we be transdisciplinary even, and how and where is it appropriate? And it really comes back to what the challenge is. Is the challenge, sometimes the challenge, it requires a transdisciplinary approach in order to make a difference, and other challenges might require a discipline-specific response, and that's okay. So I think the first thing is really identifying in each case where the challenge is coming from and what the nature of the challenge is. And that comes back to how we structure the hubs from the outset in terms of understanding the challenge and rooting them in place to know what is the most appropriate response in that setting and in that context. So in the hub, in the One Ocean Hub, what we've tried to take is quite a country-led approach, and that is to look at, in the context of each of the countries we're working in, what are the key challenges that we want to address in the lifetime of the hub? And within each of those, what is the most appropriate response? And so what that's enabled is multiple disciplines to coalesce around a common challenge. And that then by having that common challenge, we're beginning to build and bridge relationships across the disciplines to work together towards that common challenge. So it really comes, to me, it comes down to what is the context of the challenge, what is the challenge, and what is the most appropriate response. Because, Lat, as you said, we are, whilst we are being challenged to be transdisciplinary, we're trying to be transdisciplinary within an academic system that supports not transdisciplinary, but often interdisciplinary is even challenging. And really, we're in a system that is disciplinary siloed. So it's that constant competing challenge and the pressures that puts on our researchers. So our researchers, although they are in a research for development project, they are also still under the pressures of their own institutions and the wider sector to publish in high quality journals. They are often disciplinary journals. So it's balancing that. And so the way that we've tried to do that in the Hub is really to take the challenge-led approach, to coalesce where it's required and where it's the appropriate response. And so I think that to me, in terms of where it's the successes, we're beginning to see those areas sort of emerging in the Hub around specific challenges that really do require multiple disciplines to come together to not just come up with the technology, as you put it, the science response of, well, we've got a technology for that, but how do we then implement that for change? How do we actually move the system so that change really happens on the ground? And that often requires multiple disciplines to work together.
Thanks, Jo. Lisa, as you reflect on the question, I'm interested in hearing how the arts are being integrated into this kind of project, because as we started this session, you sort of referred to yourself as an outlier. And I wonder, is that your experience within the Hubs? How are arts-based solutions being integrated? Are they being integrated well? What advice do you have?
Thanks, Michelle. What I would say, just firstly, to add to what Lata and Jo have been saying, is that I think one of the things I'm seeing that's incredibly positive that's coming out of this transdisciplinary approach is that I come from a humanities background, an art history background, primarily in my academic studies. And so, science is not something I'm overly familiar with. And so on the one hand, I'm learning a lot from my science-based colleagues and academics and researchers, but I think it's when we come together too that we can share our own specialisms and our own knowledge. And so things that perhaps, our science colleagues might not have considered, but that could have a huge impact onto the types of challenges that they're facing and also the ways they're proposing to go about providing solutions. Can be hugely benefited by the input of an anthropologist or a cultural historian or a sociologist. And I think that is an opportunity that hubs like we're talking about today, bring all those expertise together while also including the voices of the very communities that we're working with. As for how the arts can play a role in all of this, I think in the past, I think the arts have perhaps been not dismissed, but have been included as a bit of an afterthought, or particularly in science-focused research, perhaps as a way to disseminate research findings, rather than thinking about how art in and of itself can be a research mechanism. And I also think that artists can reach a huge audience. So a painting potentially is going to speak to far more people than a 100-page academic report. So I think the value that we place on what art can do, and I should say when I talk about art, and I referred to this in my introduction, but I think we have to think about art in as broad a sense as we can. So not just visual art or visual culture, but theatre, performance, music, as I said earlier, traditional knowledge and cultural practice. And I think if anything, COVID and the lockdowns that we've all been experiencing worldwide and the continued effect that's having on art practitioners and creative professions is impacting us all. I think, you know, none of us are going to music concerts, none of us are seeing new films, none of us are, you know, going to fashion shows if that was our inkling. But so I think we're seeing by the space at the moment in the arts sector just how important and meaningful it can be to our lives and how enriching. What I think is really exciting, and part of the reason I joined One Ocean Hub and was so excited to take on this role, was that through a lot of negotiation, and I'm sure Jo might be able to speak to this a little bit more, but through negotiation with UKRI, Jo and our colleague, who's also at the Glasgow School of Art, Dr. Stuart Jeffrey, were able to negotiate that we could offer funding to art projects that are usually deemed ineligible in these types of academic studies. Often what happens is you have requirements that funders place, and that's because they want to protect their money and make sure that it's going to reputable people and the projects will be completed and there will be outputs and outcomes, and and it's a lot of paperwork and basically there are a lot of hoops through which artists have to jump. And artists, in their broader sense, again, that's not what they do. They're creatives, they want to make work, they want to have discussions. Filling out streams and streams of documentation is sometimes not an easy job for them. And so what we've been able to do through the DEEP Fund is offer direct funding to individual artists, to collectives, to community groups, and really ensure that the money is going straight into the pocket of these creative, amazingly creative people in communities all around the world and in our partner countries. And what that's also allowing us to do is directly support creative economies in these countries. And that's something also that has a huge power, I think, and can often be overlooked when we think about, the development goals and what it is that we're trying to affect and the change that we're trying to affect. But as I said, Jo might like to talk a little bit more about those negotiations with UKRI, because and the reason I mention it in this discussion is that it is quite a groundbreaking approach, and where I know that we all, the research team I work with in this area of the Hub, are incredibly appreciative that UKRI are trusting us to try this new approach to funding.
Yes, before we invite you to tell us all about that, I wanted to introduce Daniel, who has now joined us. If you see me adding on layers, I just have to say I live in Scotland, and therefore the temperature drops dramatically from time to time. Daniel, welcome, and could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you are inserted within the One Ocean Hub?
All right. Okay. Thank you. As Elion mentioned, I'm Daniel Dokuninoti. I work with a local NGO in Ghana, southwest part of Ghana, and we are mostly into coastal and fisheries governance. And currently, I'm also pursuing a PhD degree at the University of Cape Coast. So basically, that is what we do. We work with fishermen and local communities, trying to look at their livelihoods to reduce the dependency on the natural resources, their dependency on the natural resources. So I joined the Hub, I think around last year, when there was this inception meeting, which was organized in Cape Coast. My organization was invited, and I showed interest in some of the IRs, so I joined this particular one. Yeah, I think I'll end here.
Thanks, Daniel.
Hello.
Jo, could you tell us more about the project that Lisa mentioned and how you managed to persuade UKRI to see the light?
Be the light. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it comes back to what I was saying in my introduction of aligning all of these different systems, not just in terms of aligning systems together, but aligning them to what we've been challenged to do. And quite often what we're finding is UKRI were very ambitious in their call for these GCRF interdisciplinary, challenge-led hubs to deliver change and impact at community level. But the actual practicalities of how you do that within a system that has been designed for UK disciplinary institution-led research is, they're just banging heads together. And so it's taken quite a long time, and every week almost it feels like there's something new that comes up that doesn't fit. System says no, and so we have to go back to UKRI and sort of work with them on it. And I have to say UKRI have been incredibly supportive and open to these discussions, and it feels very much like a partnership. And I think at the beginning of the hubs, the GCRF teams at UKRI brought all of the 12 hubs together. We now have a managers group for all of the hubs that sort of meet on a monthly basis and work through some of these issues as a collective. So I have to say that the support and openness has been really, I don't want to say surprising, but it has been really encouraging. But I think the key thing is in this, and not just the arts, Lisa kind of outlined how challenging it is for artists, but it's not just artists. If we want to have transdisciplinary research, we have to be able to engage with those we seek to benefit from the outset. And they are members of a community, small scale fishers in our case. But how can they engage with us if we are not able to support them in a meaningful way to properly participate and meaningfully participate, as opposed to just listen when we go and speak with them? And that requires a different kind of, in many cases, a different kind of funding and a different mindset with our system. So we're continuing to work with UKRI on that. The Deep Fund was a really great example of where we can come together and discuss those challenges and be more flexible within the system, but it's still happening on a sort of case by case as opposed to just built in from the start. So what I would hope is all of the many lessons learned around these large hubs will be brought together so that if they do continue to fund in this area or this type of area, that those changes are built in from the outset. Because by not building them in from the outset, it's not just a constant time on all of us in the hub, but it's relationships that are then made even more difficult to build, because you can't just really meaningfully engage those individuals from the outset, which, if we're doing transdisciplinary work, is when they should be engaged. They should be engaged from the pre-proposal stage. But how can they, if to engage means taking a day off work and not getting paid for what they do? So they can't engage. So we're not doing transdisciplinary work until we're halfway through a project. And even then, it's come and engage with us. Okay, let me go and talk to UKRI. And the whole thing just takes a huge amount of time and energy. And so one of the main, the areas of lessons has to be in actually having a system that supports that engagement from the outset, as opposed to on a case-by-case basis.
Thanks, Jo. Daniel, I wanted to get your input on this. I remember at some stage during the life of the hub, I felt that we should wait until we had all our ducks in a row, systems in place, before we engaged with NGOs or communities in country. And now reflecting back, I think we should try as much as possible to connect with them, even if we are still unsure about what the process might look like, because they can help us think through what that process ends up looking like. It's really a balance that needs to be struck. Daniel Puano has, works with a lot of organizations. What kind of advice do you have for organizations that are wondering at what stage should they engage with local NGOs? Should they wait until everything's settled, or should they allow them to see them in their sort of naked, haphazard, early stage process?
Okay, so thank you very much. I think we can look at this in both ways. Sometimes it's also good to sail whilst you are building the boat. So for me, I know most projects it's better you engage the local people from the start. But in our case, it's already ongoing, but it's never too late, because if we start engaging them now, if you also want to wait and put things together before we engage them, then things might also delay. So I think even though we are not all that serious, we are not sure about all these things, we can still go ahead, engage these people in some at some level, so that at least we'll, because we're also talking about time here, the project has a timeline. So I think even though the hub is not all that set, we can still engage these local people or the local NGOs, so that they will also be aware that there's this thing going on, and as time goes on, they will be involved in certain things. And it should also be clear with the local NGOs will be engaging, so that they will know their terms of reference, what exactly are they doing on the project. Yeah. So I remember for my organization, David once sent me an email to join a conference, and I discussed that with my director, but he was also asking what are we actually doing on the project. So I also think that if you try to engage the local NGOs or partners we've identified, then things should be clear from the beginning. Maybe this is what you will be doing, and this is what that is where maybe your level will reach. We will be doing this, and then maybe you will help us engage with the local people. So I think if you're able to do that, then things will be clear enough going forward. So I think we can still sail the boat as we are building it. Thank you.
I like that phrase, sail the boat while building it. Lata, do you have any sort of early stage hindsight lessons?
I would concur with a lot of what others have said. I think, one of the reasons I think that we were successful is that we were ambitious for what we wanted to do and who we wanted to bring together in dialogue. So I would sort of echo what Joe and Lisa have said around UKRI, sort of seeing that ambition as a good thing. So there is some, it suggests to me that there was at least an attempt to sort of think outside the box. So, is this an opportunity to break down those silos and do things differently? I think early on, so I and 4 or 5 other colleagues were involved in the proposal writing stage. I think that was an early victory, is really important. Because as I said, huge amounts of support and goodwill for the idea that we have to have this interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary or, social science kind of dialogue early on. And actually in the proposal writing stage, because this question of, when do you go and talk to people? Well, actually, the way the proposal was brought together was bringing as many stakeholders into the room in the proposal writing stage as possible. And I think that was a real strength. But it is actually in the doing where we're still sort of finding some of the challenges. So a good example is actually even in just the language that we use. So some of the very basic barriers around, what actual language are we expressing ourselves in, right? So it is always English. It's always the English language. And then that has certain challenges when you're trying to tick the boxes of, say, UKRI, who are saying, okay, look, you've got to talk about gender. And some partners are going, well, you know, that's not an issue, or we don't, whatever it is that's going on, we don't use that language to describe whatever it is you think that means, because we're not thinking of it in those terms. So in a way, it's, so at some level you might think, oh, if we'd had this conversation in advance, we could have pushed back earlier. But in a way, you don't know until you start working together what those barriers are. So you can try really hard to anticipate those challenges. But sometimes, you know, it is this business of, you know, building the boat while you're sailing. I mean, sometimes you don't have a choice because there is no way to anticipate those challenges. So the challenge of the English language in an abstract sense is you can anticipate, of course, what specifically it looks like, what kinds of you know, mechanisms could be put in place to overcome those challenges. You just don't know until you actually get all those people in the room, and then you work out that it is an issue at all. Because also you don't know what sorts of knowledges and insights people are bringing into that space, who they brought into the room with them. So, you know, one of the things about the Water Security Hub, the way we're the sort of the model is that you have country collaboratories. So you're not trying to make big pronouncements about that country. It's very much about, you know, it's a basin approach, if that makes sense. So we're saying, okay, look, there is this water system, right? So in the case of India, it's the Yamuna basin, or in Ethiopia, it's the Johor basin, or Colombia. So you've got these, it is a very regionally focused thing. And then the idea is to say, okay, what lessons do we learn in order to scale that up for a wider understanding about what water security means? So again, in terms of who's going to be in the room when you're having these discussions, there is only so much of that you can anticipate. I think, you know, I'm assuming One Ocean Hub is 5 years. I mean, water security is sustainable, we're 5 years. What you feel very quickly is that 5 years felt like a long time when you're applying. 5 years doesn't feel so long when you're actually doing. Suddenly it's like, oh, I wish I had another 5. You know, could you you know, go back to UKRI and said, you know, can we extend it? I mean, that is again, in terms of the lessons we might share, there maybe is some scope to push back to funders and go, look, you know, you were very ambitious, we appreciated the support, but actually what we found is that 5 years, you know, you might want to know big changes have happened in 5 years. We can tell you, having done it, that, for instance, 5 years is not enough. I think we could be a little louder if we all join forces on that point. But yeah, I think building the boat while you're sailing it, to sort of echo that sort of thing is in a way inevitable. But yeah, it's an important process what we're doing, because there is huge amounts of pressure to work in this way. So reflecting as we go along is hugely important. So yeah, again, really great to be having these conversations, because, you know, they're hugely valuable.
Yeah, this reminds me to bring it back to the question of how to have dialogue. You said in the room, did you mean a physical room? But before we get to that, I will ask Lisa and Joe both to reflect back. Are there any sort of hindsight lessons about those early stages that you that come to mind?
Well, Michelle, so I was, well, a little bit late onto the project. So I joined the team in late January. So a lot of the discussions and the concepts and the identifying challenges and the writing of the grant itself were done well before I'd even heard of One Ocean Hub. And I really want to congratulate everyone that worked on that, because it's an amazing achievement just to even be at the point we're at. I just wanted to pick up on what Lata was saying too, with this idea of, you know, measures of change, and how funders do want to know that you know, miraculous things have happened. And I think sometimes that can create a disparity, because what a funder might think of as you know, a meaningful change could be quite different to the places that the work is happening, you know. And sometimes the smallest of changes can make all the difference, depending on what it is you're looking at and who you're working with. So, and I would say that too about discussions taking place collaboratively from the very outset, is that, you know, sometimes what a funder or a team might think the problem is, you know, might actually be something just that little bit different on the ground or in the field, so to speak. That without, you know, those conversations with local knowledge holders and you know, people that live in these, you know, environments on a daily basis, you know, can really add those sometimes small but incredibly vital pieces of information that can make all the difference.
Joe.
Yeah, sailing while you're building the boat, Daniel. I think that is the most appropriate phrase I've ever heard. Certainly for our hub, we had no choice but to start sailing, I think, before we had a hull, let alone a whole boat. But I think again that sort of when do these stakeholders come in? Just coming back to that original question, for me, it needs to be at the proposal stage, and that, you know, in hindsight, and if we could go back to UKRI, well, certainly, you know, some of the advice that we should go back to UKRI is that there has to be more support and more time at that pre-proposal stage. I mean, LATA, 5 years, we're also 5 years. I cannot believe how quickly it's going. And, you know, it feels to me almost like the projects of this sort of size and scale, if they want 5 years worth of research and research for development, they have to precede it with at least a year or even 2 of setup and inception. I mean, we had a very short inception phase, 3 months. I mean, you know, and we didn't even know we were having an inception phase. So you have to plan for an inception phase in order to get the most out of it. And so I think, again, that the sort of timing and expectation, it is about managing expectation often at the funder end. And that what that would allow us to do is to define, is to work with the beneficiaries that we're looking to work with, you know, the communities and so on, to define what impact would mean for them. And so it's not the funder's preconceived version of what good impact would be, but it's actually defined by those who we think we want to benefit. But what does the benefit look like to them? I'm sure it's different to what UKRI might have in their own minds. And so I think having the time to do that is really important. I mean, I think that's probably wishful thinking, but I definitely think that would help us, you know, not necessarily build the whole ship before we start sailing, but at least get us somewhere in doing that, and also to ensure that the stakeholders are really meaningfully embedded in the research from the outset. Otherwise, you are just doing research and disseminating it. You're not doing proper transdisciplinary research, which requires more time.
Thanks, Joe. So yes, LATA, I wanted to bring it back to, you referenced dialogue a number of times. I guess my first question is, how well did everyone know each other at the outset? And how do you have these dialogues in you know, the actual sense of it? How do you have meetings? Do you Zoom? Are they in the room? Do you have facilitators? Snacks? We want all the details, and also what are the outcomes? When you have friction, how do you resolve it? Is it based on this group that you've referenced several times, the relationships? Do you just hope time heals all wounds? Tell us everything.
Right. So, I mean, I don't think anything gets done in academia without biscuits. So, you know, preferably more catering than biscuits, but biscuits to be going on with. Actually, what I would say is that Newcastle's leadership on this was really fantastic, in the sense that they were very supportive of the bid. and they provided resources for bid writing meetings. So to answer your question, we were all actually physically in Newcastle over a period of days to write the proposal, which I think I don't have enough experience of these big bids to know what other groups have done. I had the privilege to be invited to be a part of this, and I thought that was I do think it's a strength, and you know, if it's not regular practice, then it should be, because it made a huge difference. Does that mean that you don't have disagreements? Of course not. I mean, you're bringing a whole bunch of people who don't know each other into a space. So what I would say is I can't speak to how those choices were made. I was very much an invitee rather than an inviter, because the hub is led in Newcastle. So I think what's clear is that Newcastle were the sort of the bridge or the link, and knew quite a lot of the stakeholders. What the way they managed that though was to do a bit of mixing up, right? So in the case of the water security, it was led by the engineers. It's Professor Richard Dawson. Again, he's just really good at kind of listening and was very committed to bringing everybody together, which was really important. And what was deliberately a part of that plan was to do that mixing up, right? So let's get, you know, some of the engineers from this country with the social scientists from that country having that conversation in the bid writing stage. Does that mean that everybody thought that everything was important? Of course not, because you come in with your disciplinary priorities and your perspectives, and everybody will also be bringing their own incentives for participating, right? So it's, yes, everything that drives us was water security, but it was also about, you know, other things. It was about, you know, sets of incentives and priorities that have to be balanced, right? And also capacity. So it might be that actually in principle, yeah, everybody's committed to water security, of course, but actually it's about capacity. Can we, in that meeting, you know, are we having discussions about, okay, well, this might be the plan, but, you know, if we got the money, could you actually do it? You know, and also discussions then about, you know, we're applying for this pot of money. You know, are we budgeting enough for you to be able to do it? And this is always a tension, like particularly with the UKRI funding. I know working with, in other funded projects with other stakeholders, where, for instance, you'll get a lot more resource for, say, academic time than you would for, say, NGO partners. Or you have to work much harder to make a case for Southern-based partners and the resources that they need than the Northern-based partners. Depending on the funding pot, you have to actually say that a proportion of those funds are actually staying in the UK. Now, some of that has evolved, it's changed, but some of those things were in place. So all of those things have to be negotiated, and they invariably create tensions. But to sort of answer your very nitty-gritty mechanical questions, we were all in Newcastle for about I think it was 3 days, and there was lots to eat. Which I think, you know, did make a big difference, because when we did get the money, obviously hugely exciting. And I was very much kind of brought in, tried to contribute. The PIs are the ones that went and did the interviews. I mean, I wouldn't want it for a second to take any credit for the fantastic effort that they made. And it was the PIs from Newcastle, Leeds, Oxford, and all the collaboratories that actually went to the interviews. I wasn't involved in that process at all. But what did happen is that when we actually got the money and we met again in Newcastle for our first planning meetings, it did feel a little bit like people were old friends, that sense of having accomplished something together, and the rapport had already been kind of set. That it was hugely valuable. Of course, there were tensions, it's not like everybody was getting on and there will be those inevitably. Everybody is individuals coming from different countries, language challenges, whatever. But it absolutely made a difference that we had spent some time building that rapport in advance. So when it came to planning, everybody had a sense of why they were there. We had we knew people on a first name basis, and it was a hugely important element of that process that I think has made it a lot easier to navigate the inevitable challenges that we've already talked about. I think Lisa and Joe and Daniel, you sort of talked about in different ways, but it does make it easier, definitely.
Thanks, Lata. So for anyone in the audience taking notes, make sure that there are biscuits and other snacks. I want to bring in the audience. There's a question. The panelists mentioned the challenge of siloed academic systems. Is there a difficulty finding young researchers that have the skill sets to work across disciplines and with external partners is their need to further integrate inter/transdisciplinarity into the structure of the undergraduate education system. So I can begin to answer this, and then I'll throw it to the rest of you. I coordinate the Early Career Researcher program at the One Ocean Hub. And my sense is that the early career researchers are actually much more flexible about working discipline. For those who are postdocs and PhDs, they're likely the ones interfacing with the stakeholder groups, whether they be at the policy maker level or at the quote unquote community level. So I think that the future is bright for this kind of research because it is being embedded at the early career researcher phase. More established academics have a lot more on their plates and therefore might not necessarily find working in this way to their benefits. They don't have a lot of time to give, but they also have a lot of experience. If they've done this in the past, they have a lot to share, they know how to build relationships, and so are able to build the capacities of others who might not. So Lisa, as PGRA, do you feel that you're well equipped to undertake transdisciplinary research?
Thanks, Michelle. I think it's something. I guess in answer to the question that's come through, it was quite some time ago now that I did my undergraduate studies, but back then it wasn't something that was even thought about, let alone taught. You know, you very much were, you know, a student of anthropology or a student of the history of art or a student of psychology or whatever it might have been, and so I think as I've studied more, as I completed my PhD not too long ago now, but even that, you know, I could sort of see a shift that was taking place. I also think that, you know, for early career researchers, especially, it's almost the nature of the work now, which is a really positive thing, I think. But how you might necessarily teach that, I think, is something that we all really need to consider and need to think about. And I guess if as academics, you know, we're talking about this idea of silos, then, you know, how do you not only break those down, but then bring that into a teaching environment as well? And I don't know, maybe if that's something Lata might be able to comment on, given to her more extensive experience in teaching. But it's certainly a challenge. But I do agree with what you've said. I think that I think it's just a part of the way we operate as younger researchers and younger academics. And almost why wouldn't you want to work that way, I guess, yeah, you sort of look at the history or the historical record of some of the not so wonderful research that has been done over the past and some of the real damage that's been caused. And I guess, you know, you reflect on that and you think, well, why wouldn't we want to do it a different way and a better way? So.
Thanks, Lisa. Lata.
Yes, thank you. I mean, the answer to your question, Michael, is yes. We do need to be thinking about this, and we are siloed, and it is a challenge. I think, Michelle, you're absolutely right in that sort of young people, young sort of defined very broadly, but early career researchers coming through the system are probably more likely to be comfortable working that way. But I think we need to try harder within university education systems to provide that support and training. And I think we're getting better at that. So a good example is a colleague in civil engineering, Barbara Evans, who's one of the PIs on the Water Hub, has with colleagues managed to get funding for a doctoral training center that has explicitly, like, has interdisciplinary work built into the training. Like, that's the kind of thing we need to be doing a lot more of. And what's been great about that is that, you know, I I come into the frame to be able to be a supervisor for really a civil engineering student, which, you know, I think even 10 years ago, you'd have thought, well, what would a social scientist have to say to a civil engineering, you know, PGR? But actually, it's hugely valuable. I get to learn about that discipline and how it works, and, you know, what constitutes a doctor. But those students benefit from an interaction with different perspectives. So I'm doing a guest lecture next week, and but it's about trying to make that more systemic. So trying to get, you know, higher education institutions, funders to also think in those more dynamic ways. I think in answer to your question, I think, yes, it's an issue. I think we are getting better, but I still think there's work to do, definitely.
Right. Well, with respect to the Center for Sustainable Development at the University of Strathclyde, it's definitely a step in the right direction for cross-faculty working and teaching and research. And they are actively trying to engage this in undergraduate programs. So that's good news for this kind of collaborative work going forward. So I wanted to talk about the elephant in the room, and in terms of, you know, building the boat as you sail. What if there's a huge storm that appears on the horizon? For example, COVID-19. How has, you know, the pandemic affected plans? And, you know, it provides an opportunity to learn a lot about a worst case scenario and how you adapt to that. So, Joe, tell us a little bit about what's been happening, what the reactions within the wider context of the hubs, UKRI, and our researchers, as well as engagement. We were used to Zoom working before, but now it has escalated exponentially. But what are other challenges related to the pandemic that have emerged?
COVID, it always comes up. I wonder if we'll ever have a discussion like this where COVID isn't centre, but it has to be, because it is, you know, as you'd expect, had a quite significant impact on not just our hubs, but I know the other hubs as well, from talking with the managers group. I think, to me, there's sort of two areas. Well, you could classify things in two areas in terms of how it's impacted us. It's impacted us in quite a obvious way, and a way that can be, you know, sort of quantified and recorded for UKRI, and that is, you know, obviously our stakeholder engagement has been significantly challenged. We are unable to go and do the community level work that we had planned. In many cases, we had started. We have tried to do what we can by virtual means. So, for example, researchers in South Africa have quite quickly put in place it sounds like a very basic sort of WhatsApp messaging group, but what that's done is allow us to continue direct engagement with small-scale fisher leaders around the coast of South Africa despite the pandemic. Again, that required a negotiation with UKRI about whether or not we could charge data access as an eligible cost on our grant. These sound like small things, but, you know, they're really, really important things in order to enable those fishers to engage with us. Otherwise they just wouldn't be able to. Then there's engagement with governments, and our programme is about ocean governance, and so engaging with the authorities who have the power in ocean governance spheres is really important. But you throw a global pandemic into the mix, and their priorities have completely changed. Their interest areas have completely changed. As we emerge out of the pandemic, their priorities will have shifted, and they'll likely have shifted towards significant economic growth as a result of an economic downturn. So how we work with that and how we re-engage them in our programme and realign to those priorities or not, and have discussions around that. So that's the kind of stakeholder engagement side. On the other practical side, there's just constant uncertainty. in everything that we do. I mean, how do we replan when we might go to the communities, and how do we replan fieldwork? We have one of our research programs is deep sea research, what's offshore biodiversity and offshore spatial planning. And that is centered on an offshore research cruise that was meant to go out in 2022, but it's in the schedule. It's one of the Research Council vessels. So as the cruises from this year get pushed back, the ones from next year get pushed back, and we are in a holding pattern. But if we don't go to sea, how much time is then left to analyse the samples? So this level of uncertainty means it's planning and replanning and replanning, but there needs to be some sort of end to that planning so that we can actually realign and start to do again. So they are the sort of really kind of, as I say, quantifiable, practical issues that we can report against. But I think almost more than that is the sort of intangible ways that the pandemic has affected us. People's time on the hub is already small. In many cases, sort of 20% of a researcher's time or 30% of a researcher's time. You suddenly throw in all of the things that the pandemic has kind of obliged us to do, homeschooling, additional caring responsibilities, basic stress and strain of working from home means that despite all of those other things, progress is slowed. But how to report against that to UKRI and have that understanding. And the other sort of more practical side as well is that we learn through this that everybody's idea of, oh, well, there's a pandemic, the campuses are closed, everybody shall work from home. But it's not possible for everybody to work from home. I mean, some of our partners, after a few weeks and trying to reach them via WhatsApp and other means, we learn they don't have internet access in their home, so they can't come and join a Zoom call, or they have internet access that's shared with multiple family members, so their bandwidth can't support multiple Zoom calls. So how do they engage in the hub meetings? So coming back to the topic of bridging, it has added another layer of bridging that's required to ensure that all of those researchers are properly supported to do research in a context that nobody ever thought we were going to have to do research in. But I think as well, what we're going to see happen is some of our countries will emerge and are beginning to emerge. Indeed, Ghana, our colleagues are back on campus, which is really lovely to see. They will emerge quicker than the UK, who we seem to be going backwards a little bit in recent weeks. So it'll be a challenge to try and when everybody's not in the same stage of the pandemic. So ongoing, but it'd be great to hear what it's like in the water security hub. Lata, I imagine you've had similar challenges there.
Yeah, sorry, Michelle, did you want me to respond? Yeah, it was just to echo everything you're saying. But if we sort of bring the lens out, because everything you've said, Joe, is just yes. All of those things are the same. Obviously, we've got different also infection levels in every country, which makes that planning very difficult. So talking to colleagues in India, just that very human sense of, we can't do things if it's not safe. And how do we make those measures? At one level you can think, okay, well, country level partners have to be kind of responsible, but there is a duty of care, and we are spending the money from here. We can't just think, well, it's kind of up to you. We are a collective and we have to be looking out for each other. And what are the metrics that we're using? So that's part of the ethics that we have in that emergency kind of, can we come up with COVID guidelines that we all feel comfortable could be, well, not universal, but at least give us a sense that, if those benchmarks aren't being met, it's not safe to do the research. I'm literally having those conversations at the minute. But in terms of bringing the lens outward, I suppose it is also interesting for us to reflect, and again, in thinking about these lessons that we draw from our shared experiences, feeding back to donors, about the flexibility of donor requirement reporting, and also timelines, because even in even without a pandemic, as we've already agreed, 5 years felt initially like a long time. And then suddenly you've got your budgets and your timelines and all these partners, and you're like, oh, it's not as much time or as much money as I thought. Oops. Okay. So, you know, we're going to have to sort of think about this, you know, in a more considered way. But in a way, I would say there's two challenges. The first is there is just the timing. So what happens now, and that uncertainty around, can we deliver on the things that we have promised to deliver? And is there a way to sort of feed back with UKRI to say, okay, well, you know, how do we actually build in contingencies for crisis? You know, because this isn't going to be the last one. This isn't going to be the last time that UKRI or GCRF UKRI, whatever form that takes in the future, is going to be confronted with this. And it may not be a pandemic, it might be something else, but it's not going to be the last time that we are going to have to be thinking about what happens when we introduce a new challenge like COVID into the mix. But I think the other element of that is then thinking through what that means for the sorts of outcomes that are expected from a big project like this. And how can we be a little more fleet-footed about what it means to be functioning in this? So what is the learning from this crisis? To what extent are we sort of given the support and resource to adapt to the crisis, but also for the crisis to then feed into the learning, if that makes sense? So in other words, maybe our deliverables are going to look different, and how does the funder respond to that? And I think, again, UKRI has not been too bad in sort of us having to adapt, but whether the resource exists for us to say, okay, so now we've got this new crisis situation, what does that mean for our deliverables, and how do we feed that back to the funder? But also, how can the funder support us to adapt what we said we would deliver on the basis of our new context? That dialogue has to be an ongoing one. I'm not sure the way research funding is set out is entirely is set up for that kind of adaptability. And it is something, again, in terms of the learning, be wonderful as we move forward to have that conversation, you know, again, in a constructive way. You know, what as hubs collectively have we learned about managing this crisis? What do funders have to do in order to support changing objectives, changing contexts, and not just in terms of, you know, deliverables, but the actual challenges around livelihoods, around people's health, around, you know, all those other things that happen that invariably cost money too, you know. And so what do funders need to know from us about that? So again, it's, you know, I raise that as a challenge and something that we probably need to talk about in another year or two, to sort of think about what that means for us.
Absolutely, Lata. Indeed, having this worst case scenario allows us to think about adaptability in situations that might be less fraught. And that's a kind of a good thing, I suppose. We prefer not to have COVID-19, but then it opens our eyes to other ways of working, other ways of structuring funding. So yes, we'll keep recording the learning, and hopefully there's a place to input it. Daniel, how have you been impacted by COVID-19, and how has it affected your working?
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, so this pandemic has really affected, I think, almost everybody, even though people are getting some economic empowerment through COVID, but we have been affected badly because in my part of the world, Ghana, and basically the Western region, internet facilities here are not all that good. Even today, as I'm joining, I'm having some problems. It's raining heavily here, and the network just keeps moving and just going back, but I'm still trying to yeah. So this morning I was actually in a community to talk to some women who are oyster collectors, and some other women who are engaged in other activities. And I just wanted to find out from them how the COVID has affected their livelihood. And for those women who even do petty trading, they had to travel to the capital to get some foodstuffs or other things to sell. And when the COVID pandemic came down, I think there was a lockdown in Ghana, mainly in the capital and also in the Ashanti region, and it affected these women even moving their movements. And what they really relied on was the little profit they had made and saved. That is one. And then when you go to the fishing communities, some people who are even transport owners who were using transport as their means had to also suffer in this way because the government got some restrictions on the number of passengers you even pick in a vehicle. So it also affected their sales. Yeah, so for this pandemic, it has really brought a lot of thinking. And now I think what we should also be looking at is looking at the One Health concept, looking at environmental health, animal health, and also human health together, because nobody realized this pandemic was going to shut down the whole world, and it really showed. We even started working from home, but it wasn't all that easy. Or even getting the internet facility to work was very difficult, but we are still trying and managing. So I think the COVID has really brought a lot of pleasant circumstances and situations to us. Yeah, because some of the fun and most projects to have timelines. So you are supposed to deliver, and this pandemic is in, you can't go out to the field to collect data, and it really affected. But when the ban was lifted, most of the partners were good with us. They gave us the room to get some PPEs, basically the nose masks and the hand sanitizers, and even some projects went to the extent of providing us with some Veronica buckets and other things to distribute to our fishing communities. And I think this also helped in some way mitigating the effect of the spread of the virus. Yeah, so it's really affected our work, and it's still affecting us. Yeah.
Thank you, Daniel. This One Health concept is one that, is a learning that's generated by COVID, but was peripheral to our awareness, but then becomes very centered once we are, challenged by such a big crisis. I have millions of questions. I had sort of made my question, arrange them according to controversial, how controversial they were going to be. But I see that time is wasting, and we have only 7 minutes. So I'll go right to the bottom and find one that may cause us to maybe have a debate or think, have to be more diplomatic in what we have to say. But I want to kind of challenge the idea of research for development, right? And how we measure success and what we think of as good outcomes. So, as hubs, we are asked to consider the gender dimensions, and also poor impact and that sort of thing. But that sort of involves imposing our ideas of what good society is on other regions. And I want us to reflect on that. How do we feel about that, and sort of the power dynamics at play underneath all of that? I know, Lata, you think about this almost every day, so I'll start with you to give everyone else a chance to think about how they want to frame their answers.
I'll keep this short because we're running out of time, and I feel a little bit like I might have monopolized the airspace a little bit. But I would say that I suppose I worry about that dynamic, and it's become very stark in the context of COVID, without wanting to talk about COVID all the time, but it's become very stark in the context of COVID that the global north doesn't have the monopoly on knowledge or practice, funnily enough. We can be, let's take the UK as an example. We can be the 5th or 6th richest country, depending on who and how you're measuring, not just now, but like in the history of humanity, and yet can get this pandemic response really quite disastrously wrong. And that has all sorts of dimensions which we don't have time to go into. But I wonder whether the starting point is acknowledging, so if we were to change our terminology, so if we were to take the SDGs and say, actually, the SDGs are truly global, which means that actually if we actually started to think every country is a developing country, let's just say we actually turn the terminology on its head. So actually we are no longer a developed country, because I don't even know what that means. And anyway, if you really want to be sustainable, we can't keep growing because we're going to need like 3 more planets. So actually we are also developing. So let's say we did that. Then we could actually have a much better discussion about learning, about, you know, whether that's environmental health, whether that's WASH, whether that's water security. And actually that question of who needs something, and so that question, say, of resource distribution, can become a much more nuanced one. We could do perhaps what we might call now in our jargon, South-North learning. You know, we're not at all interested in the fact that Africa's in the aggregate, there's variations. Obviously, Africa is not a monolithic place, but lots of African countries have had a much better pandemic, if I can call it like that. And there's no curiosity at all here, no interest at all to work out why that is. Instead, what you get is a Western media trying to come up with lots of reasons like, oh, Africans are very young, or, oh, they've already got some kind of herd immunity. This very patronizing kind of, you know, as opposed to thinking, well, why don't we look at the public health strategies? Why don't we look at the ways in which actually quite a lot of diseases exist and they have to manage them all the time? Why don't we look at the expertise that they've developed and, ooh, maybe we've got something to learn. And we literally are just not interested in doing that. But if we were to turn the lens, the SDG lens, and really, which was what it was meant to be, was a global set of goals, what would our discourse look like if we actually thought of ourselves as developing? That would be my kind of thing. And then that question you're asking about, what does gender mean? Well, that would be a global level discussion, wouldn't it? I wouldn't be imposing it on anybody. It would just be one set of ideas that you put into the pot, and then we'd all have a discussion about what it meant. That's not the world we live in, but I strive to be a part of a world that where that is the case. So it's nice to be in the same virtual room with all of you and maybe have that discussion as we go forward. So thank you.
Lisa.
Gosh, I would strongly echo what Lata has said. And I think this idea of research for development, I mean, I've been very privileged over the last decade and a bit to be welcomed into communities throughout the South Pacific, in Australia and New Zealand, as well as what we would think of as the islands. And, you know, my learning from that has been like nothing I could have ever imagined. And so I think this idea, as Lata was kind of saying, that there's a global north that is seeking to make the rest of the world a better place is a really sad concept. And so I very much agree with the idea that good outcomes of research are where we all get better, and we all become kinder, and we all become more compassionate and more giving and more caring.
Jo.
Wow, what a question to end with. But yeah, I think it's a really important point, and it's such a sensitive area, and one that we feel every day in how we carry out our hub business, is this perceived or actual kind of flow of information and knowledge and but also power that is unfortunately inherited to us when we take on these grants, where the money is coming from, and the remit to which the hub responded kind of makes it often feel even more so like this global north, global south dynamic, which is not helpful in these contexts. And so I think, again, it comes back to the way the calls are designed. They are designed with that imbalance, unfortunately, and it's our duty as researchers to develop the partnerships that are fair and conscious of that power dynamic, that to counter that, and again to feed those lessons back to UKRI about how we do it. But yeah, it's yeah, big. I think we could have a webinar on its own just for this topic.
It does seem that way. The Q&A section has lit up, so maybe that's what we should have started with. There is a question, Elisa, I think you want to answer, and that will be the last one. Any other questions, we'll follow up with attendees who want to answer. So Lisa, if you could quickly to respond to Michael's question, I think, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I think this is such a fantastic way to finish this webinar for now, at least. Michael has is asking that, well, he's saying that, you know, it's fantastic to have representation of arts and humanities in our discussion here today. And he's asking, should we lobby for an 18th Sustainable Development Goal for arts, culture and humanity? And Michael, my answer is absolutely yes. When can we start? You've got a panel here of 5 incredibly eager supporters. But I just thought that was such a lovely way to finish the discussion, and such a great idea. So from the bottom of my heart, I would love to see an 18th SDG, and I'm sure Lata and Joe and Daniel and Michelle would all agree with me. I'm getting thumbs up. So thanks, Michelle.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. Daniel has disappeared again because of internet. I would have loved to hear from him on, you know, this question on research for development, power symmetry, et cetera. But maybe we'll include him if we do have a webinar specifically just on that topic. I want to say thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us. I really enjoyed this discussion, and I think there's just so much more we could have talked about. And I expect the dialogue will be ongoing amongst us. Each of you represents a treasure trove of information, and I hope that all those in the audience also feel open to contacting you if they have any more questions. And I hope that the discussion has pointed towards practical and actionable solutions and activities for any other institutions listening in. And with that, I bring this webinar to a close, and I hope that you have enjoyed it as much as I have. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, everybody who organised.
Yes, thank you.